Greetings, Viceroys. You all know the drill by now. We're going through the epic cornerstones and Against the Storm and rating them into one of the 5 tiers that you see on your screen. S, A, B, C, or D. If you haven't seen the Legendary Cornerstone video or the Buildings Tier List video, I would encourage you to do that. Believe it or not, I had a harder time rating the epic cornerstones compared to the legendary cornerstones. Now, why is that? Because the epic cornerstones, they don't stand out as much. While the legendary cornerstones are very flashy in their own ways and they have very powerful effects, both positive and negative, the epic cornerstones, there's a lot of duplicate effects on these. There's a lot of very similar epic cornerstones, and some of them just don't stand out very much. There's a lot of bloat, you could say. And if you look at the tier list, you'll see that the B tier and the C tier are actually the biggest tiers. There are some rather good epic cornerstones in the S tier, and I don't think there's going to be too many surprises there. The A tier has some what I consider to be standout cornerstones, but they're not amazing. That said, let's get into it. As always, we'll be using the in-game encyclopedia and going alphabetically. I'll give a little discussion afterwards about what each tier means exactly and when you should be re-rolling. As always, think to yourself as we're talking about it, how would you rate this epic cornerstone? Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? I'd love to hear either way. Advanced Herbalism, plus 50% to amount of goods produced in the herb garden. Okay, so this increases your root production per farm tile to 5 from 3, and it increases your herb production to 9 from 6. That's pretty darn good. We all know that food is a good thing. You can make biscuits that way. You can use the roots to make raw food. This is very potent. It's worth noting that there is a corresponding cornerstone for every single farming building. You have large baskets for the plantation, you have reinforced tools for the small farm, and there's also one for the forester's hut, and I forget what that one's called exactly. And I rate all of these pretty much the same. Food is important, and these cornerstones give you a lot more food. So let's rate it. That's right, this is going into the S tier, our very first cornerstone, and it's going into the S tier in position number 5. I think you can take this at just about any time of the game. I will call out cornerstones which are better in the early game or better in the late game, or both. There's something to be said for cornerstones that are good in the late game, because a lot of them do fall off in the late game. Advanced Herbalism is good throughout most of the game. Alright. Next up we have Bed and Breakfast. This time it's the guild who's going to pay you, not the other way around. Gain 10 amber every time a trader arrives. This is very good. I had a game once where I summoned 3 traders and I got 40 amber from this on year 2 or 3. And I was able to complete that timed order, which gives you, or requires 70 amber, and it gives you a lot of very good rewards. Bed and Breakfast enabled me to do that. I've never completed that timed order aside from that one occasion. This is a very good cornerstone. This does fall off later in the game if you've already summoned some traders. Bed and Breakfast won't be as good. Let's rate it. Bed and Breakfast. This is going in the A tier, all the way at the very top of the A tier. I don't rate this as S tier because this does fall off in the late game. And if you've already summoned a number of traders, then Bed and Breakfast may not help you. But this is extremely strong. Of all of the amber cornerstones that provide you just raw amber, Bed and Breakfast is one of the better ones. Okay. Biscuit Diet. A farmer's favorite food. Farmers have a 75% chance of producing double yields while under the effect of biscuits. How do we rate this? This is kind of similar to Advanced Herbalism, right? Because it's giving you more farm yield. If you're using humans to farm, you'll have a 20% chance to double your farm output. Which means when you plant like your 6 grain, for instance, you've got you're getting 120% of that because of the 20% chance to double. This is giving you 75% chance on top of that. So you're getting actually like 195% chance, or 195% return on your 6 grain, which is very nearly 12. The point is, this isn't exactly a 75% chance. This is closer to 60. I'm not going to do the exact math, but this is more like a 60% increased production. And that's very comparable to Advanced Herbalism, right? Which gives you just a flat 50. Biscuit Diet requires you to have biscuits. And if you don't have biscuits, you're not going to benefit from this. So I find this one a little bit suspicious. You're not going to have biscuits until later in the game. And by the time you have biscuits, you may not need the raw materials so much. Let's rate Biscuit Diet. Biscuit Diet. This is going into the C tier, all the way at the very top. Because this has potential, because this is actually kind of just as good as Advanced Herbalism, the only caveat is you have to have biscuits. And for that reason, I think this is very situational, but it can give you a lot of value. Okay, Blood Price Contract. We talked about this one briefly last time when we talked about bone tools. I consider Blood Price Contract the weakest of the 3 sister cornerstones, the other one being Cannibalism, which is the best. Because Blood Price Contract, it doesn't give you, the tools gives you a way to win the game. It gives you some direct compensation for losing those people. Cannibalism prevents you from starving. Blood price contract, it's like, okay, now you're kind of playing to a weird alternate win con where you're generating amber. And yeah, this is an amber generating cornerstone. We can compare it to something like bed and breakfast. You might be able to get 40 amber, 50 amber out of this. That's not terrible. Blood price contract, you certainly can get some value out of it. Let's rate it. Blood price contract is going in the B tier, kind of low down. I think because this pairs well with Hidden from the Queen, and it is a lose-less cornerstone in some ways, you can take Blood Price Contract, but there's probably a lot better choices, and you may want to consider re-rolling it. Alright. Next up we have bread peels. Bakery production is 50% quicker. This will only be offered to you if you have the bakery, and I rarely ever see this. What this does is, if you have 2 workers in the bakery, that's kind of like having a 3rd worker in the bakery for free. Now you have a 3rd worker. And the problem with this is you can just make another bakery, and you could just make another bakery and have another 2 workers in there if you need more people in the bakery. This is giving you production speed, but only 50% and only at 1 building, which the bakery is a nice building. You may not be using it until later in the game. I would probably not take this the vast majority of the time. Let's rate bread peels. Bread peels is going into the C tier, fairly low down. I think this is very minimal value. If you're later in the game and you absolutely need biscuits and pie and you're short on workers, you can take bread peels. I wouldn't recommend it though. The vast majority of the time, you're going to re-roll this one. Okay. Burnt to a crisp. This is a significantly better cornerstone. Gain 20 coal for every 3 burned blight rot cysts. You're going to burn 10 blight rot cysts on year 3. So if you get burnt to a crisp on year 1 or 3, on year 3 during the storm, you will get 60 coal by burning 3 blight rot cysts. 3 times is 9 blight rot cysts. That's 60 coal. This is extremely potent. It's going to solve your hearth needs for fuel. It's going to allow you to make some glade salves with the coal. And even better, it makes you capable of producing even more purging fire to produce even more blight rot and burn it again to get even more coal back. It takes 9 coal to burn 3 blight rot cysts, and you're getting 20 coal back from it. So this is just the gift that keeps on giving. I think a lot of people like burnt to a crisp, and with good reason. Burnt to a crisp is going into the S tier on position number 2. I think there's only 1 cornerstone in the game which is comparable to burnt to a crisp. This is probably the cutoff for the S plus tier. I think everything below burnt to a crisp is not quite S plus tier as far as epic cornerstones go. Alright, next up we have Cannibalism. This is the sister cornerstone to Blood Price Contract. I picked this in a game recently. I've picked this a few times. I had a game where I had 13 people die, and I got 390 meat, and I was starving the whole game. Like, I was just having food problems, and I did win that game, only barely, and if I didn't have Cannibalism, I think it would have been a complete loss. This is a good cornerstone. Typically, you don't want people to be dying. However, starving is a very real risk. This mitigates that risk a lot. Let's rate Cannibalism. Cannibalism is going into the bottom of the A tier. Because I don't like to lose people, I rate this one a little bit low. I do think Cannibalism belongs in the A tier. This isn't going to break your game. This is a good insurance policy against starving, and you won't always get use out of this. You kind of don't want to get use out of it, but when you need it, you need it. Alright. Clay delivery line. 3 clay per minute, and we'll rate a whole bunch of delivery lines at the same time because I think they're all kind of similar. Clay delivery line, this is just 3 clay per minute, which is 12 clay per season or 36 clay per year. And 36 clay is what? That's enough to make about 12 bricks if you're doing it at the crude workstation. So 12 bricks a year. Like this is good. This is pretty good. One of the concerns I have in the early game is being brick locked, and clay delivery line really solves that problem for you. You don't have to worry about finding a source of clay or stone. This is pretty good. Let's rate a whole bunch of delivery lines and then we'll talk about them. Alright, let's rate these delivery lines. We've got grain delivery line, clay delivery line, and root delivery line, which is right here. And then we also have fiber delivery line, which is in the B tier, and fiber delivery line is going to be... and fiber delivery line, which is in the B tier. I rate fiber delivery line a little bit lower because I think fabric is less important than bricks. So the clay delivery line is going to be better, and clay can also be used for pottery, which is very nice. Fiber, like the alternate uses for this other than fabric are oil, which you'll usually have something you can make into oil. I think plant fiber is just a little bit more attainable in general. Clay and stone are the more precious resources. So those are the delivery lines. I think most of these are very sturdy. If you see a delivery line, obviously these are going to be better early in the game. If you're late in the game and you already have these resources, you may not want them. If you see these in the early game, they're usually a very, very solid pick. Okay. Let's move on to Crowded Caravan. Each newcomer group has 2 additional villagers. This is really bad. I think the caravan sizes as you get into year 4, 5, 6, they get fairly large, and you're going to slow down on taking people. You don't need that many people. You're going to get people from quests. There's really no reason to want additional villagers coming with each caravan, and I think this is pretty much going to be the worst epic cornerstone. Don't take Crowded Caravan. I really can't think of a single situation where I would draft Crowded Caravan. Let's be honest. Alright. Deep Pockets. Receive 10 amber for every 5 completed trade routes. This is a bit better. This is another amber producing cornerstone. You can relate this to Bed and Breakfast, which is giving you 10 amber every time a trader shows up. Completing 5 trade routes, and a trader shows up about once every season, by the way. Deep Pockets. How often do you complete 5 trade routes? Like, yeah, you will complete 5 trade routes, but maybe you'll complete 20, 25 trade routes in a game. I guess if the game goes on long enough, if you're doing well enough, you could complete significantly more trade routes, but it's very unlikely. You're maybe going to get 30 amber out of this, I would say. 30, maybe 40, if you're doing well. I think Deep Pockets, because this makes you wait to get the amber until you've completed 4 trade routes, and you can be trade locked, like this doesn't help you with trades, it just makes it more lucrative slightly. And this doesn't improve trade routes the same way that trade negotiations does, which is a much better cornerstone. So Deep Pockets, this isn't very good. Let's rate it. Deep Pockets is going into the B tier, right below Blood Price Contract. I actually do think Blood Price Contract is better because it's more of a lose-less cornerstone, and I think you're going to get a comparable amount of amber out of it. Maybe you'd get slightly more out of Deep Pockets, but either way, Deep Pockets, there's a lot more better choices out there. Driving water. Water is not only used to power engines, woodcutting speed will increase by 10% for every 150 units of water used in rain engines. We will talk about reinforced axes later on. Reinforced axes just gives you a plus 35% woodcutting speed. This gives you a 10% woodcutting speed for every 150 units of water used in rain engines. This is not very good. Woodcutting speed is a nice stat. It allows you to cut through trees faster, to get more wood, to find glades faster. There's nothing wrong with woodcutting speed, but this takes a while to stack. 150 units of water is going to take a while to use, and by the time you get there, you may not be running so many woodcutters because you want to run your woodcutters early in the game when you're less pressured by hostility. So driving water, this is a nice effect, but it comes on way too slow. Driving water is going into the C tier, somewhere in the middle. Most of the time you're going to avoid this cornerstone because it does give you something of value. I kind of slightly rate it, like I don't think it's quite D tier, but this is a very poor cornerstone and you will re-roll it the majority of the time. Alright, next up we have Dye Extractor. Gain 5 pigment for every 10 insects gathered, or insects produced. I believe this does not count the insect mound if you convert that glade event and you get the insects per minute. I don't think this counts. There are insects on the cursed woodlands inside of trees. You can find insects on the ground there as well, I believe. I would consider picking Dye Extractor on the cursed woodlands, but any other biome, I think this is kind of suspicious. If you have a source of insects, if you're on the Coral Forest, for instance, and you have a source of insects in the Improved Trappers Camp, yeah, you can take this. It's just nothing very impressive. Let's rate Dye Extractor. And, of course, think to yourself, where would you rate Dye Extractor? This is going into C tier, actually right below Driving Water. I rate this one even lower. Pigment is not a particularly good resource. It's not very valuable. Generally, you're not going to take this. If you're on the Cursed Woodlands, you might be able to pick Dye Extractors. Alright, Exploration Contract. The Royal Academy wants a detailed map of the region and will supply anyone willing to help. Gain 20 reeds and 20 clay for each discovered glade. This is okay. Reeds and clay are fairly nice. Clay can be used for pottery, reeds can be used for training gear and wine, and also fabric, of course, and clay can be used for bricks. These are resources you want to have, and you can open small glades to get this benefit. Because this is so sturdy, and because it provides you clay, which I frequently am dying for bricks, I'm starving for clay to make the bricks, this is something you can very likely get value out of. Let's rate Exploration Contract. Exploration Contract will find itself in the A tier, a little bit close to the bottom, kind of below the delivery lines. This is still very good though. If you've opened up a lot of glades already, you may not want to take Exploration Contract, but because this works with small glades, This is quite good. If you want to take this early on, this is a pretty sturdy pick early on. Export Specialization. Gain +1 production yields for all pack of goods. How do you rate this one? When I first saw this, I put it at the bottom of the A tier, and it was there for a while up until recently when I changed the tier list before producing this. Of course, pack of goods were buffed recently. They're all worth more amber than they used to be after the latest patch, and this applies to 5 different types of pack of goods. This applies to pack of provisions, pack of crops, pack of trade goods, pack of luxury goods, and pack of building materials. All 5 of those. And it increases them by 50%, except for pack of provisions, which it increases by 33%, repeating of course, from 3 to 4. This is quite strong. There's a lot to like about this. You need to make pack of goods to put them on trade routes. The queen asks for them in quests. They're so valuable. This is just providing you value, and you can use the makeshift post to do all this stuff. It turns your makeshift post into a little bit of a beast. Export Specialization is really darn good. I don't have enough good things to say about this. Let's rate it. Export Specialization is going into the S tier, right around the middle. I think when you see this, you can be drafting it the vast majority of the time. Export Specialization is just a value machine. There's very few situations where you wouldn't benefit from this. Alright, and we're going to move to, we already talked about Fiber Delivery Line. We'll talk about Fiery Wrath. Resources you sacrifice in the Ancient Hearth burn 5% longer for every impatience point you have. You can get up to 14 impatience points or 70% sacrifice time. Let's say you're hovering around impatience 10, that's 50% extra sacrifice time. This is the same thing as the old effect on the temple, and I did rate the temple as a D tier building. I think it was kind of bad. I think what's kind of okay about Fiery Wrath, this scales with your impatience, so if you're losing, this gives you a little bit more value. But this effect is not very good. You really don't need to be sacrificing for extended periods of time, or you shouldn't be. And for that reason, I think Fiery Wrath is pretty mediocre. It's interesting to note that this does actually synergize with the new version of the temple, which rewards you for sacrificing goods for a long period of time. That's not enough to make Fiery Wrath good. Both temple and the Fiery Wrath are pretty poor, and you shouldn't be drafting either of them very often. Perhaps not too surprising, Fiery Wrath is going in the C tier, just above Driving Water. This is okay. You can take Fiery Wrath some of the time if you have no better choice, but perhaps you're going to decline this for 10 amber or use a reroll. Most of the time, you're not interested in Fiery Wrath, especially not at the beginning of the game. Next up, we have Filling Dish. Porridge production is increased by 1 for every 150 units of drizzle water produced. If you have drizzle water production, this is okay. You may get to 3 stacks if you're lucky, when it still matters. This comes on a bit slow. It comes on real slow, actually, and you need to have drizzle water because you can get up to a +2, +3, maybe more if you're really producing a lot of drizzle water. This is okay. However, it's unlikely you're going to get as much value out of it as you think. Let's rate Filling Dish. Filling Dish is going into the C tier, right below Biscuit Diet. This is an okay cornerstone. If you have the Drizzle Geyser, you can draft this, and that'll get you your value out of Filling Dish. If you don't have a source of drizzle water other than the Rain Collector, I would probably never take this. And if you get this later in the game, it's not going to be very good for you either. Firekeepers Armor. Allow Firekeepers to combat corruption more efficiently. Every burned Blightrot cyst removes an additional 50 corruption. We can compare this to Queen's Gift, which is a legendary cornerstone, and that gives you 50 extra Hearth endurance for every impatience point you have. This recovers 50 Hearth endurance every time you burn a Blightrot cyst, so your break-even time is going to be however many impatience points you have. Whenever you burn that many Blightrot cysts, that's when Firekeepers Armor is going to overtake Queen's Gift in how much value it's provided. Just to make a comparison, in Queen's Gift I put in the C tier for a legendary cornerstone. Firekeepers Armor, I think this is okay. This is okay. Let's rate Firekeepers Armor and then we'll talk about it. Firekeepers Armor will find itself at the bottom of the B tier. Because this is alright later on in the game, on year 6, if you're really leaning into rain engines, I've seen people get clapped by Blightrot. It's happened to me. It can happen to you on year 6 or year 9 when you're not quite expecting it, when your rain engine usage is through the roof. Firekeepers Armor provides you a bit of insurance. If you don't have that second Blight Post, you may be totally fine if you take Firekeepers Armor. Probably you're not looking to take this. It is okay. It can prevent you from losing to the Blightrot in a pinch. Next up we have Flame Amulets, an artifact infused with the power of the Holy Flame. Hostility from woodcutters is decreased by 4, which is actually 12 on, I think, Viceroy difficulty and higher. Woodcutters normally cost you 24 hostility each, and when you have Flame Amulets, they cost you 12 hostility, which is significantly better. My problem with Flame Amulets is this doesn't give you better minimum hostility. Think of this, when the storm happens, the first thing you may do is mash that unassign all the woodcutters button. When you have Flame Amulets, this isn't going to help. Once you're not running any woodcutters, that's it. You're not going to get any hostility reduction out of this. So I don't quite rate it for that reason. This is okay if you have something like Woodpecker Technique where you're motivated to woodcut during the storm. Typically you can woodcut during the drizzle and clearance cycle, and you don't need to do it during the storm. So I don't really care for Flame Amulets so much. I think this is maybe not so great of a cornerstone. Let's rate it. Flame Amulets is going into the C tier, somewhere in the middle. This is okay. In some situations you can pick Flame Amulets. In general though, I would probably re-roll this. I don't think this is quite there. You're going to find better cornerstones than Flame Amulets. And I know some people like Flame Amulets, but I don't see it. Force of Nature. The Forest and Everlasting Rain are connected somehow. Gain +2 to stormwater production for every 2 woodcutters in your settlement. Alright, let's rate Force of Nature and then we'll talk about it. Force of Nature. This one is going into the D tier, kind of a D+ cornerstone. So this gives you extra stormwater production when you have woodcutters assigned. If you have a stormwater geyser, you probably don't need this. You're probably going to produce a perfectly fine amount of stormwater. You may need one extra person in the geyser, like a second worker. It's really not necessary to be producing an extra amount of stormwater from the geyser. If you have the rain collector, this could give you a bit of stormwater production if you have the rain collector. But if you have the rain collector, that means you have to be gathering stormwater during the storm, and that means you have to be running as many woodcutters as possible during the storm to benefit from this. And during the storm, you may not be able to run woodcutters. You may have to recall them to save hostility. And if you do that, you're getting absolutely nothing from Force of Nature. So this doesn't really help you in the situation where you have the rain collector, potentially, and it doesn't really help you in the situation where you have a geyser. Not really. Overall, this is a very weak cornerstone. Probably decline this one or reroll it the majority of the time. I do rate this one D+, because you can get some value out of this, maybe in certain situations, but more likely than not, no. Let's move on to frequent patrols. Every loyalty solve lowers your hostility by 10. We like hostility reduction. Loyalty solves we don't really care about so much. Hostility reduction is good. This is not so easy to stack. Most of your loyalty solves are going to come from caches every time you open a cache with tools, which doesn't happen until later in the game, usually when you're about to win anyways. You can solve some Glade events with a loyalty solve, but it's not something you can count on. You're not always going to be able to do it, and you may not always find them. I don't think this is particularly strong. Because it gives hostility reduction, I do rate it somewhat. It's just a little bit slow to be good. Where would you rate frequent patrols? Let's see. Frequent patrols is going into the B tier, kind of in the middle. Because this provides hostility reduction, I think it is draftable in many cases. But you do want to be careful with this. It's just not very potent. It is retroactive. So if you do find this later in the game, it is actually one of those cornerstones that's beneficial later in the game as opposed to earlier. Alright, Friendly Relations. Boosts Global Resolve by 1 for every 3 levels of standing with other settlements and trade routes. The bonus is added retroactively. If you have 4 civilizations next to you, you can get them each to level 5, which is a total of 20. You can get to 6 Global Resolve stacks on Friendly Relations. You're unlikely to get to 6 stacks. You have to have all those trade routes, you have to have all those cities you can trade with in the first place, but this is good. For an epic cornerstone, it's not too difficult to get 1 or 2 stacks of this early on. Friendly Relations for an epic cornerstone is providing quite a bit, and remember Survivor Bonding, which is kind of an A tier cornerstone, and most of its benefit is 1 Global Resolve stack. This is, I rate that as an A tier legendary cornerstone. Friendly Relations can get you that 1 Global Resolve stack kind of early on. Let's rate Friendly Relations. Friendly Relations is going into the S tier. This is rather good. Most of the time you do want to take this when you see it because it provides a retroactive benefit, because it has a very high ceiling. If you're not trading at all, or you don't think you're going to be trading, well, you may have different problems, but in that case, maybe don't take Friendly Relations. the vast majority of the time, yeah, this is worth your time. Fungal Guide. Ancient mushroom farming techniques described within. Mushroom production increases by 1 for every 25 times it's produced. This is of course interesting on the marsh because there's mushrooms on the ground and also from trees, and you will get a lot more mushrooms that way. It's slightly awkward as well on the marsh because if you're harvesting from the proto mushroom, you will end up getting a huge amount of mushrooms, way more than you need, at the expense of pickled goods and other resources that are found on that mushroom. So this is slightly awkward. It is good though. Obviously more food is good, and this comes on slightly slow, but it is quite powerful. You can get a lot of stacks out of this, on the marsh in particular. Let's rate Fungal Guide. Fungal Guide is going in the B tier, near the top of the B tier. This is more of a B+ cornerstone. If you see mushrooms around you, take the Fungal Guide. It's really that simple. Generous gifts. Wealthy settlements attract wealthy settlers. Newcomers bring 40% more goods with them for every hearth level gained. I like this one because it's fairly easy to upgrade your hearth, and the way the game rounds, even if you have a 40%, if a villager group was carrying 1 amber, now they're carrying 2, right? The way the rounding works in this game. It's easy to upgrade your hearth. It's easy to get like 2 hearths upgraded to get an 80% or even get 120%. And I don't take newcomers too often, but newcomers carry goods which you may not otherwise be able to have. So generous gifts is somewhat unique in that it's providing you, potentially, resources which you otherwise can't get on the map. This is quite nice for that reason. I rate generous gifts pretty well. Let's rate generous gifts. Generous gifts is going in the A tier on position number 2, right below bed and breakfast. This is not so good later in the game because later in the game you're going to slow down on your villager intake rate. And the other thing about generous gifts is if you already have a group of villagers waiting to be accepted and then you take generous gifts won't apply to that already arrived villager group, which is unfortunate. This can be quite good, however, especially if you get it early on, like year 1 or 3. Next up, giant vegetables. +2 to vegetable production, gain additional vegetables every yield. This of course triples your vegetable production when you pick them up off the map, and we'll see a lot of epic cornerstones which do something very similar, +2 to some resource production. This also works with a small farm, and it turns your 3 stack of vegetables into a 5 stack per fertile soil tile, which is quite nice. You can use that to make pickled goods. You can just use it to eat raw. There's nothing wrong with that. Giant vegetables, let's rate it. Giant vegetables is going into the A tier, right above Cannibalism, near the bottom. This is quite good. This triples the amount of vegetables you pick up off the map, and this will only be offered to you if there are vegetables in your current biome, which means it's almost always relevant. If you don't have the improved foragers camp, maybe this is a little bit more suspicious, and if you don't have the small farm, then maybe again it's a bit suspicious. This is a really good cornerstone on average though. Golden Marrow. Some fossils contain valuable surprises, gain 2 amber for every 20 sea marrow produced. So each small stack of sea marrow has approximately 20 sea marrow in it, which is approximately 2 amber you'll get from each small sea marrow deposit. Large sea marrow deposits have about 80, and they give you double sea marrow, which means each large sea marrow deposit has about 160 sea marrow, which is equivalent to 16 amber. And after doubling considerations, you're probably looking at 20 amber or so per large sea marrow stack, which is okay. If you have 2 large sea marrow stacks, you're going to get about 40 amber out of this. I think Golden Marrow is nice. This has a lot of potential. You can open a glade and find 4 large sea marrow stacks. It's not likely to happen, but it can happen, and that would be worth quite a bit of amber. Let's rate Golden Marrow. Golden Marrow is going into the B tier, right above Blood Price Contract. The thing is, you're not likely to get value out of Golden Marrow. It's very dependent on having that sea marrow, but if you do have a couple large sea marrow deposits, then you can take this, and it's going to be pretty reasonable for you. Better than taking 10 amber from a decline anyhow. Grain bags. Specialized grain farming techniques. Grain production increases by 1 every 25 times it's produced. I'm not terribly impressed with this. If you're running the small farm, this is not going to come on very quickly. It's going to scale rather slowly, and by the time it's giving you a benefit, your food supply will likely have stabilized by that point. I'm overall not terribly impressed. If you are picking grain up off the map, then yes, this is okay. If you're doing that on the Scarlet Orchard, you can use this and it'll increase your grain production. If you're using the Foragers Camp, if you have the improved Foragers Camp, that's where you want to be picking grain bags. In general, though, you're probably not going to take this. It's okay. Let's rate it. Grain bags is going into the B tier, above Firekeepers Armor, but near the bottom. I rate this one significantly lower than Fungal Guide and even the meat equivalent Cornerstone. because typically you're taking the small farm, and I don't think this is as good with the small farm as you may believe it to be. Grain delivery line we already talked about. This is really secure A tier cornerstone. Guild Catalogue. Traders will have one more perk or blueprint for sale. When you draft an epic cornerstone, you're drafting a perk, something that you could buy from a vendor in some capacity. Although there's not exactly a one-to-one relation between what vendors offer and epic cornerstones. The idea is, if you take Guild Catalog, you're basically saying, I don't want a benefit right now. I don't want a perk right now. I want vendors to have one more thing available that I can purchase with my money. So this isn't really providing value. This is, nice. It would be nice if vendors provided one more perk in their offerings. But when you're drafting an epic cornerstone, I think typically you just want to get your benefit right away. And if not, maybe take your 10 amber so you can afford something from the merchant. The reason you might take Guild Catalog is it's late in the game and you have a lot of amber and the other choice is equally bad, then maybe you take Guild Catalog. But usually this is pretty weak. Let's rate Guild Catalog. Guild Catalog is going in the D tier. This is kind of a D plus cornerstone. Still, you're going to avoid this one the vast majority of the time. Let's move on. Next up we have Hidden Reward. Gain 1 ancient tablet for every 2 completed Glade events. This bonus is added retroactively. A couple things to note here. First of all, the bonus is applied retroactively, so you can take Hidden Reward later on in the game, and that's actually a good thing. You want to be taking this later on, and there's not too many cornerstones that are good later on. A lot of them are good early on. So Hidden Reward is nice for that reason. The other thing I can say about Hidden Reward is this does apply to all Glade events. It's not just Dangerous and Forbidden Glade events. This is all Glade events. If you open a Glade and find a mini abandoned city inside of that, you can get a lot of stacks on Hidden Reward. And of course, it's worth noting that on the Scarlet Orchard, tablets scale with the Archaeologist office, and you can sell these on trade routes always. These are okay, and the Queen asked for these in quests as well, so this can enable you to turn in quests. I don't dislike Hidden Reward. I think a lot of people don't rate this one. This is alright. Let's put Hidden Reward into its tier. Hidden Reward is going into the B tier. I think this is kind of a B plus cornerstone. This is like maybe around the cutoff for a B plus cornerstone. If you're on the Scarlet Orchard, this is probably more of an A tier cornerstone because you can get benefits with the Archaeologist office to go with it. And this does enable you to take certain orders from the Queen that you may not otherwise want to take. So there you have it, Hidden Reward. Moving on, we have industrialized agriculture. This is the same thing as advanced herbalism, but for the forester's hut, same with large baskets. Leather gloves, +2 to reed production, gain additional reed from gathering, farming, or production. Of course, this triples your reed production. The unfortunate thing about leather gloves is you can be offered this on the marsh, although there are no reeds on the marsh, asterisk. The one exception to that is the proto wheat, which has reeds on it for some reason, and that is the only place on the marsh where you can pick reeds up. And if you're harvesting from the proto wheat, I think reeds are the least important thing on it. You probably don't care about the extra reed production at that point. I do like this cornerstone on maps like the Scarlet Orchard and the Coral Forest. If you're on one of those two biomes, I think this is actually pretty nice. You can sell reeds on trade routes. At least I think you can. There was a patch recently that changed trade routes, but I'm pretty sure you can still sell reeds on trade routes. And these can be turned into wine, into fabric, or into training gear. There's a lot of reasons to like reeds. Because this is just providing you triple reeds off the map, leather gloves is quite good. Let's rate leather gloves. Leather gloves is going in the A tier above giant vegetables. I like this one a lot. If you're on the marsh, then be careful about drafting this because there are no reed deposits on the marsh aside from the one. Next up, we have leftover crops. Gain 2 pack of provisions for every 10 herbs produced. I like pack of provisions. Trading, of course, is crucial. There's a lot of things that synergize with trading. You want to be doing it. And making provisions so that you can trade and get amber to open glades. This is, of course, a crucial pipeline. The one bad thing about leftover crops is if you have herb production, if you have a lot of herbs coming from the herb garden, then you're probably going to have enough herbs to make some pack of provisions with them. So this is giving you something which you already have the ability to make because you have herbs. And of course, the other bad thing about this is you need herbs. Like if you don't have a source of herbs, you're not going to benefit from leftover crops. And you may not have it. For that reason, I think this is a little bit underwhelming. It's good if you have the herb production. If you have the herb garden, then yes, probably you want to take leftover crops and it will give you a decent amount of value. Let's rate leftover crops. Leftover crops is going in the B tier, actually nearly smack dab in the middle of the B tier. For all the reasons I said, I think this is reasonably powerful, but it's providing you something that you already could do, and you need herbs to make it happen. What is kind of funny about this is the game has a strong opinion of what constitutes crops, right? Because to make pack of crops, you need grain, mushrooms, roots, or vegetables. You cannot use provisions to make crops, but for some reason, in this case, provisions and crops and herbs are all kind of related. I don't know. I don't know what they were thinking with this naming convention. Local taxes. Gain 20 amber for every 100 ale produced. I had a game on the Coral Forest where I had humans, beavers, and harpies, and this was very, very valuable for me. And think of it this way, you're gaining 2 amber every time you complete an ale recipe, which is pretty darn good. 2 amber is worth more than the 10 ale produced. So this makes your ale recipe quite a bit more powerful. It is unfortunate that you have to produce 100 ale in order to get your amber. You don't just get your 2 amber incrementally, right? You have to actually produce 100 ale to get your 20 amber. So that isn't good. Typically, you're not going to produce ale. Local taxes is kind of underwhelming because typically you're not going to make the ale. Not until later in the game. You may get a lot of value out of this. It's just very situational. Let's put it into its tier. Local taxes is going in the C tier, right below filling dish. This is still a C plus cornerstone in my mind because it does have a good, very high ceiling in the amount of amber it can provide you. It's just unlikely to align with what you're currently producing, to say it lightly. Alright, next we have Lost in the Wilds. Gain 1 villager every time you discover a new glade. I picked Lost in the Wilds one time. There was one time several patches ago where I embarked and I had only 8 people in my caravan and I was forced to take 8 people. I had no other choice. And I like starting with 11 people. I want to be firm about that number. I like having 11 people in my starting caravan because there's so many things you can be doing on year 1. All these buildings you can be making, things you can be gathering, wood cutting, of course. I like having 11 people. And when you have 8 or, God forbid, 7, it just feels very light. I did pick this once because I opened a small glade immediately and I got my 9th person and I felt like I had a more productive year 1 because I had my extra person. That being said, let's put Lost in the Wilds into its tier. Lost in the Wilds is going in the D tier, kind of in the middle of the D tier. You're probably going to give this one a pass, and I know you can get caravans of size 7 after the most recent patch. What I dislike about Lost in the Wilds is you're going to reach a certain point in the game where you slow down on intaking new villagers, like where you're done, where you have too many people. You need to manage your hostility. And this will make it more difficult for you to open glades because it's going to increase your population size. It's going to give you more hostility for opening glades. So you may not want this later on in the game, even if you do pick it early, and maybe you could pick it early like I did to supplement your year 1 workforce, but I would extremely caution you against doing that because this could come back to bite you. Next up, we have meat specialization. You've managed to enlist some excellent hunters. Meat production is increased by +1 every 25 times it's produced. This is the same thing as grain bags and the fungal guide. This is of course rather good on the marsh because there's a lot of meat on the marsh, and this is good on the coral forest because you can get meat from the mussel trees. Let's just rate meat specialization. Meat specialization is going in the B tier, 3rd from the top. This is okay. It can be a little awkward for the same reason I mentioned the fungal guide is awkward, where you're getting a lot of meat and maybe you're not getting other resources you want, like wood on the coral forest. It could make you slower at harvesting wood because your woodcutters are spending all this time carting huge stacks of meat around. I had a hilarious game on the marsh once where I was up to 10 or 11 stacks on this thing. And I remember seeing a lizard get a double. My lizard would go pick up 11 meat, double it into 22, and then have to deliver all of that back to the warehouse. So they spent more time delivering than they did actually gathering. It was very silly. And if you have the dead Leviathan on the marsh, in this case, well, now you're going to be picking up way more meat from it than you know what to do with, and you're not going to be getting as much jerky and crystal dew from the dead Leviathan, which is what you really want from it. So this can be awkward. Be careful with it. In general, you probably do want to take meat specialization if you have the means to be gathering meat, and on the coral forest, this is almost always a secure pick. Metallurgic Proficiency increases the production speed of copper bar, crystal dew, and all recipes that use metal ingots by 33%. This is another production speed cornerstone that applies to specific things, and I'm not going to enumerate exactly what it counts, but I mean, you can see here anything that uses copper bar crystal do, which is a number of things. Like it's okay. Like things like tea actually get a speed increase for what it's worth. This overall is not too much though. It's not going to apply to too much, and this doesn't increase your overall wealth. It just increases your production speed a bit. Metallurgic Proficiency is not very good. This is going into the C tier. Near the bottom of the C tier, you're going to reroll or decline Metallurgic Proficiency the vast majority of the time when you see it. Moldy Grain Seeds. This is one I had a hard time rating. A new type of grain, gain 3 mushrooms for every 10 grain produced. I sort of like this one because I like taking the small farm, and this gives you a kind of, if you have the small farm, it gives you kind of 30% more production at the small farm. And this does apply to grain picked up off the map as well if you're getting it on the Scarlet Orchard or the Marsh or wherever. Because this provides you an edible food to go with your pseudo food, because grain is not edible. I do kind of like this. If you're gathering grain, it gives you a means to supplement your food supply in a pinch. It's not very potent though. Really, you're not going to be getting too many mushrooms out of moldy grain seeds unless you have the small farm, and even then it's not going to be crazy. Moldy Grain Seeds is going in the B tier. This may be slightly too high up. I don't know. Like, there is a lot of bloat in the B tier, and I think this is a distinctly B tier cornerstone because I value the small farm, and I think Moldy Grain Seeds does work okay with the small farm. That said, you might be able to give this one a pass, or you may want to consider re-rolling this one for one of the S or A tier cornerstones, or maybe even something else around the B tier. Moss Broccoli Seeds. Vegetables can now be produced in the greenhouse. Okay, so the greenhouse, as you all know, produces mushrooms and herbs, which is enough to make biscuits and pie by itself, and mushrooms can be used for pickled goods. Why would you want vegetables? Well, I think the main reason why you might want vegetables is because you can use vegetables and mushrooms to make skewers together. That's kind of the main reason why you would want vegetables to go with your greenhouse. Let's rate Moss Broccoli Seeds. Moss Broccoli Seeds is going below Lost in the Wilds, near the bottom of the tier list in the D tier. This is one of the unfortunate things about the greenhouse, is that it offers you this really horrid cornerstone. You probably do not need to be making vegetables at the greenhouse. If you really want to make skewers, then yeah, I guess you could take this, but this doesn't provide you anything. The greenhouse already has very solid offerings with the mushrooms and the herbs. You probably don't want to be taking this. Alright, we've got a few skips here, and then we've got Peasant Supplies. Let's compare this one to Leftover Crops. This is gain 3 pack of provisions for every new villager. I played a game once where I was offered Peasant Supplies and Leftover Crops on year 1, and I had the Herb Garden with me. And I chose Leftover Crops because I figured, since I have the Herb Garden, this is going to be a lot more valuable. I'm going to get way more pack of provisions from Leftover Crops than I would from Peasant Supplies, but I was very careful to track how many provisions I would have gained from Peasant Supplies as the game went on. And as it turns out, for the vast majority of the game, I would have been just fine. Like, Peasant Supplies would have gained just about as much value as Leftover Crops did, even though I had the Herb Garden and I was harvesting herbs from the very beginning of the game. This is a very good cornerstone. Like, this isn't dependent on anything, and this works for every new villager. This isn't just newcomers. This is if you complete a quest and that gives you a villager, this gives you provisions. Peasant Supplies is rather good. Let's rate it. Peasant Supplies is going in the S tier. Third from the top. I think this is actually the third best epic cornerstone in the game, and that might be a slightly contentious opinion. But free provisions and a very reliable source of them, because this applies to any newcomers that come from any source into your village, and provisions allow trade routes, and there's so much synergy with cornerstones and trade routes, you really want to be doing them. Peasant Supplies, I think you really can't go wrong with picking this. If it's later in the game, you might be able to pass this one up, but even then, I think this is quite good. Prayer Book. Scouts work 10% faster on Glade events for every Firekeeper assigned to a hearth. This starts with 10% with your Ancient Hearth, and if you spend all of your Wildfire Essence making 2 more hearths, you can get up to 30%, which is the same as Firekeeper's Prayer, the legendary cornerstone. And if you get a 4th hearth, you could get this up to like 40%, which is a bit extra at that point. You really kind of don't need it. I like Prayer Book. I like Prayer Book because it's difficult to get Glade Event work speed. There's not too many sources of it. The only legendary cornerstone I can think of is the Firekeeper's Prayer. Prayer Book is the only epic cornerstone that gives you Glade Event work speed, And if you don't have foxes, like, then you may really want this. If you open a glade and find the Fishman Cave, not to use the Fishman Cave like a boogeyman like I always do, but like, let's face it, you don't want to go up against that thing when you don't have prayer book and you don't have foxes. And if you're a minute late on opening that glade, it could get really awkward really fast. Prayer book can save your bacon. This thing is good because it's providing you a stat which is hard to acquire. Let's rate prayer book. Prayer book is going in the S tier on position number 4. I think this is quite powerful and small benefit compared to Firekeepers prayer. It doesn't come with that negative where sacrificing goods is more costly. Prayer book doesn't give you that same negative effect. So this is kind of directly comparable to a legendary cornerstone in what it's providing. Prosperous Archaeology. The people are invigorated by every discovered cache, gain +1 to global resolve for every 2 caches opened. It's worth noting that this applies to any way that you open caches. You don't need to do the loyalty solve. You can do any solve. This is quite good. You're usually going to find a fair number of caches, and you can just open them. If you find 4 caches, you can open them early, get +2 global resolve stacks. That's kind of worth it. Anything giving you +2 global resolve stacks on a cornerstone is really, really good. So I rate Prosperous Archaeology rather highly. So, how prosperous is it? Well, it's going at the bottom of the S tier. I think this is the cutoff for the S tier because this is providing you global resolve stacks. It's not the most compelling. You may want to wait on opening caches until you can get the loyalty solve because you want the reputation and amber to come out of the cache. And if you get Prosperous Archaeology, you may not get too much out of this until you do that. I think if you see Prosperous Archaeology, you're going to want to give a strong consideration to opening the caches anyways, but this is really good. I think Prosperous Archaeology deserves to be in the S tier because it really stands out from a lot of the bloat in the Epic Cornerstone list. Prosperous Settlement. This is kind of the legendary Cornerstone equivalent. Next we have rain pumps. Brewery production is 50% quicker. Let's rate it. We already talked about bread peels for the bakery. Rain pumps is going in the D tier. This is fairly close to bread peels, but I do put rain pumps in the D tier, D+ tier, because the brewery is not quite as good of a building as the bakery. The bakery, if you're producing biscuits and pie, it can actually be rather important to later on in the game to be producing a lot of biscuits and pie to keep that resolve up. At the brewery, yeah, you can be using the brewery to make ale. The pickled goods recipe on the brewery is not particularly good. I always talk about that. Rain pumps, this is just not providing too much. And if you do want more production at the brewery, just make another brewery. Like, you don't need rain pumps. Probably pass this one up the majority of the time. This is D+ because I can see some situations where you may pick rain pumps, but most likely you're not going to do that. Reinforced axes. We hinted at this one earlier with driving water, which gives you 10% woodcutting speed for every 150 units of water used in rain engines. This is just a 35% woodcutter speed, which is nice. So think of it this way. If you've got 6 woodcutters, that's almost like having 8 woodcutters. They're that much faster. This allows you to run more woodcutters all the time, be at lower hostility. So it's kind of like flame amulets in some ways. Not quite as good for hostility reduction, but this saves you workers. Like, this means that your workers are just more efficient overall. And woodcutting is very important. Like, woodcutting is one of the most important things you could be doing throughout most of the game. So this just provides a lot of value, and it provides it up front compared to driving water. Let's rate reinforced axes. This is going into the A tier, right below generous gifts near the top. I suggest picking reinforced axes early on in the game. This is quite nice. Even later in the game, this could really help you if you're starving for fuel. Or if you're trying to reach glades which are further away. There's a lot of things to like about reinforced axes. It's just a very solid cornerstone. Reinforced tools. This is the small farm equivalent of advanced herbalism. Definitely S tier. Route delivery line, A tier. We already talked about the delivery lines. And next we have Sahilda's Secret Cookbook, and give this one a good think. I want to challenge you to think about this one. The top 10 tips on how to cook more efficiently. That's funny. By Sahilda, gain 10 jerky for every 10 pie produced. And Sahilda's favorite number is 10, by the way. Okay, so the thing is, you need 2 recipes to make pie. You need a recipe for flour, and you need a recipe for pie. You're not terribly likely to have that for a lot of the game, unless you're lucky. And 10 jerky is the least valuable food, compared to something like Zhorgs, where you're getting skewers. Skewers are more valuable than jerky. The game thinks so, anyway. And I think they're worth more resolve than jerky is. And jerky can be produced at the field kitchen. Pie cannot be produced at the field kitchen. So you need to kind of find 2 recipes, and it's giving you something which you can already make at the field kitchen. this is okay, because anything that's providing you double food, which this is effectively doubling your food, that is good. You want to be doubling your food supply. Let's rate Sahildas, and think about this one very carefully. Sahilda's Secret Cookbook is going at the top of the B tier. I think this one does stand out from a lot of B tier cornerstones. I had this one in the A tier for a long time, and ultimately, I did demote this. And this could be a controversial opinion. I know when I talk to people about it, actually, some people weren't as big on Sahilda's Secret Cookbook as I may have expected. What's funny is I found a clickbait article. Google suggested me this clickbait article one time, and I was like in bed and scrolling on my phone, you know, and I read it, and it was like, what are the 10 best cornerstones to look out for in Against the Storm? And number one on this tabloid article, they suggested Zhorgs Secret Ingredient and Sahilda's Secret Cookbook, kind of as a duo. They're like, these are the top 2 to look out for because they're so good, they're doubling your food supply. Well, I think Sahilda's Secret Cookbook belongs to the top of the B tier. This does stand out from a lot of the riffraff in the Epic Cornerstone list, but it's kind of slow. Like I said, you're not likely to have pie production until later in the game, and the jerky is the least valuable food, the least valuable cooked food, and something you can already make at the field kitchen. So if you have pie production, take Sahilda's Secret Cookbook. Otherwise, you may not want this one. Secure Trail. Royal Stormwalkers secured the trail to your settlement. Newcomers will arrive 25% quicker. Okay, you know how I feel about newcomers. I think there's a point where you just stop accepting them, and for that reason, for the same reason economic migration is a D tier cornerstone, Secure Trail is also going to find itself in the D tier. Let's put it there. Secure Trail is going in the D tier, a little bit above some of the things in the D tier, because there is a reason to like taking newcomers, because this does work well with things like generous gifts, for instance, or Stormwalker tax. There is a reason to take newcomers, and sometimes you need like 20 humans to complete a quest. This can occasionally help, but most of the time, no. You're not going to take this. It's just not providing you the value. You don't need newcomers to come quicker. Next up, we have Sharp Sickles. This is another +2 to whatever production, and this time whatever is herbs. It's worth noting, much the same as reeds, that this will be offered to you on the marsh because the silly proto wheat has herbs on it. And if you have the proto wheat, you could take this and get additional herbs from the proto wheat. Use at your own discretion. On the marsh, you're probably not going to want this, though. I think you can pass this up. If you see this on the Scarlet Orchard, if you have the herb garden with you, then yeah, Sharp Sickles is going to be good. I rate this one slightly less than other ones, like the giant vegetables, but Sharp Sickles is still okay. Let's put it into its tier. Sharp Sickles is going into the B tier, near the top, right below Sahildas. Because this is helping your herb garden, and it triples the amount of herbs you pick up off the map, I think it's just slightly less good than things like giant vegetables because those are raw. And this can be offered to you on the marsh where you really don't want it. So that's Sharp Sickles. Silent Looting. This is just a -15 hostility every time you open a cache. Compare this to the +1 to global resolve stack for opening 2 caches. This is kind of, you get a -30 hostility instead of a +1 global resolve, which is fairly nice. I mean, I think those are comparable stats. And of course, minus hostility, anything giving you minus hostility is excellent. Let's rate Silent Looting. Silent Looting is going into the S tier, right below Export Specialization, which I think is kind of a monster, to be honest. Because above Friendly Relations, because this gives you hostility reduction, and you can do the left solve, you do the non-loyalty solve on the caches to get your -15 hostility right away. This is quite good, and you can just start opening caches right away. I do rate this slightly higher than Prosperous Archaeology, and you can think of this, compared to these to the Trade Hub and Prosperous Settlement in the Legendary Cornerstone list, like, these are similarly very, very strong cornerstones. These, of course, apply to caches and not trade routes. Next up, we have Small Press. This is another one I kind of struggle with rating. Gain 3 oil for every 10 flour produced. Now, if you have the press, this doesn't matter so much. Like, yeah, you can be producing flour at the press, but you can also produce oil rather efficiently. Oil is nice to have if you are struggling to find fuel, which can certainly happen to you, especially on maps like the Marsh and the Coral Forest. You may benefit from this extra oil, and oil does show up in Glade solves, which makes this nice. The main downside, obviously, of the Small Press is that you need flour production. If you don't have flour production, you're not really going to use this at all. And If you have the rain mill, of course, the small press is going to do quite a bit for you. Let's rate it. The small press is going in the B tier, rather close to the center of the B tier. I think this is nice. If you have the flour production, you will get a bit of value out of this. It's just rather dependent on having the flour production. And flour production is usually something I'm drafting for. Let's be honest. Next up we have spices. Herb and root production increased by +1 for every 75 biscuits produced. Oh boy. Obviously this synergizes with the herb garden. The herb garden can be used to make roots and herbs, which can be used to make biscuits, and you can then increase your herb garden production. You're probably not going to make too many roots at the herb garden. It's not efficient to do that, and yes, you can make flour from them. If you're picking up roots and herbs from the map itself, then this is going to be better. My issue with spices is this is not retroactive. You need to be producing biscuits after you take it, and you might not produce biscuits until later on. I usually don't produce biscuits at the field kitchen, and I sometimes don't produce biscuits until later on in the game, at which point getting the +1 to herb and root production maybe doesn't matter so much, because you're already stabilized with your food supply. This is okay in theory, but I think mostly it's okay in theory. Let's rate it. Spices is going in the middle of the C tier. You probably want to skip this one or consider re-rolling it the majority of the time. I think it comes on a bit too slow. If you have your biscuit supply, if you've got the herb garden and you've got biscuit supply going on, then you can take spices. Just be very careful. If you're not actively producing biscuits right now, I think this is a bit suspicious. Steel Mattocks. Stone can now be produced in the clay pit. Let's rate it. Let's just put this one into the tier list. Steel Mattocks is going below moss broccoli seeds. This is kind of a sister cornerstone, right? Because that's for the greenhouse and this one's for the clay pit. Steel Mattocks, the ability to make stone at the clay pit, basically who cares? You can use stone to make training gear and you can use it for a certain cache opening. You know, you can use it for the left side solve of caches. But that's it. There's really no reason to want stone on your clay pit. I think this is rather suspicious. One of the terrible things about the clay pit is that it opens up this cornerstone so that it's available to you, which is one strong reason not to take the clay pit. Don't be taking steel mattocks. Steel pickaxes. By comparison, this is a lot better. +2 to stone production. Gain additional stone from every yield. There's stone on a lot of maps. If you're on the marsh or the coral forest, there's going to be stone there, and this is going to triple your stone production from the map. This is quite nice. Like the other +2 production resources, and stone can be sold on trade routes. If you have a lot of extra stone, that's going to be directly equivalent to amber on trade routes. There's a lot to like about this, and of course bricks. I'm usually very frequently struggling to find a source of bricks in the early game, and this will get you there rather easily. And on the coral forest, you can get stone from the pink trees, from the ones that have incense. They also have a 40%, I think, chance of stone on them. This will triple your stone production from trees on the coral forest, and I really like the coral forest for that reason. A lot of epic cornerstones kind of pop on that biome compared to other ones. Let's rate steel pickaxes. Steel pickaxes is going in the A tier, right below reinforced axes. I think that triple stone production, like leather gloves and steel pickaxes, I think these are both really strong. I rate steel pickaxes slightly better because it equates to bricks, and I do really dislike being brick locked. Alright, Stormwalker tax. Your villagers have learned how to traverse. All trade routes are 40% faster. Well, this isn't providing any direct value, is it? Like, yeah, you may get your amber from trade routes faster, but you know how you can get your amber even faster? That's right, by declining this cornerstone, which is probably what you're going to do when you see it. And if you're on the Land of Greed modifier, absolutely do not take this cornerstone under any circumstances. That would be a huge blunder, because on the Land of Greed, you want your trade routes to last as long as possible. This is pretty mediocre, probably past this the vast majority of the time. I'm trying to think of some situations where Stormwalker Training is okay. Like if you were really cranking out trade routes like nobody's business in the late game, then this is of some benefit to you, and in that case you can take Stormwalker Training. Let's rate it. Stormwalker Training is going into the C tier, near the bottom. I did bump this one so that it's not in the D tier. It's more of a C- cornerstone because you might get some use out of this in the late game if you really have a lot of trade route synergy and you're just putting out trade routes left and right. You might be able to use Stormwalker Training, but pick this one with extreme caution. Realistically, you're going to decline it or re-roll it. Alright, Surprise Child. Speaking about declining and re-rolling cornerstones, gain 1 lizard for every 25 eggs produced. I used to think this was a good cornerstone, but it's not. It's a bad cornerstone. You don't want more population. You're going to get plenty of newcomers, and Surprise Child, it's just unnecessary on a good day. It's actively bad on another day. This is really bad. Don't take Surprise Child. Let's put it into its tier. Unsurprisingly, Surprise Child is going into the D tier. And that'll round out our D tier. We have Force of Nature, Rain Pumps, Guild Catalogue, Secure Trail, Lost in the Wilds, Moss Broccoli Seeds, Steel Mattocks, Surprise Child, and Crowded Caravans. That is your D tier. And what does the D tier mean? It means when you see these, I would say there's a very, very small chance that you're going to pick it. You likely are going to use that reroll or even decline it if you want to be conservative with rerolls. All right. Tanning racks, +2 to leather production. This is one of our final +2 to whatever production. I don't rate the leather quite as much, again, because this is compared to something like stone, which is giving you bricks. Fabric is not quite as good. Of course, leather can be used in like the leather worker to make water skins, which is very nice. If you have leather, usually you have enough of it. If you're on the marsh, there's just going to be leather for days, and you probably don't need this. On the coral forest, you may also have some leather. On the royal woodlands, I guess you could take this if you've got the slick shells and you're harvesting the slick shells because you don't have so much leather otherwise. And I think leather can still be sold on trade routes, if I'm not mistaken. This is alright. It does kind of provide you direct value by tripling your leather production from the map. It does get awkward really quick though, because leather isn't the most valuable resource, and you could find yourself with way more leather than you know what to do with. Tanning racks is going into the B tier. I actually had this one in the C tier for a while, and I decided to promote it. There isn't anything inherently wrong with having more leather than you know what to do with. Just, you know, put it out on trade routes or turn it all into fabric. You'll find something to do with it. Just, this isn't the best cornerstone. It does have a fair amount of potential. Let's move on. Tightened belt. Travel cost on trade routes is reduced by 1 provision, to be more specific. Doesn't apply to trade routes already in progress, and it scales with the amount of goods sold. So if you have a trade route that's 1 provision and 1 tool for 3 amber, now that trade route is going to be 1 tool and 0 provisions for 3 amber. And in fact, you could sell 5 tools at 0 provisions for 15 amber, which is pretty nice. If you think of it this way, this is kind of giving you provisions. I really do care for Peasant Supplies quite a bit, so as you may imagine, Tightened Belts is really darn good. And if you don't have any provisions at all on year 1 and you don't have any amber, you need a way to open glades. You want that amber. You can take Tightened Belt and then start putting trade routes out there. This is quite good. I like it a lot. Let's rate Tightened Belt. Tightened Belt is going in the S tier. I had this one at the top of the A tier for a while, but I think this actually really does stand out compared to a lot of the epic cornerstones. Because this makes trade routes free potentially, and it just scales with the amount you sell, there's a lot of things to like about Tightened Belt. Trade logs. Detailed notes on different traders and their wares. Gain 1 additional active trade route slot. Traders will arrive 25% quicker. We can compare this to Stormwalker Training a little bit, because this opens up 1 more trade route, so you have 4 trade routes instead of 3. Stormwalker Training does something similar because it means your trade routes complete quicker. The end effect is that you're going to be able to put out more trades, right? And usually you don't need to. I think 3 trade route slots is typically fine. Yeah, there are some situations where you want to put out more trade routes, and this is okay. In the late game, if you have a massive economy, you can take trade logs and get another trade route slot. What I like on here is the traders will arrive 25% quicker. That is kind of nice, and that does play well with things like bed and breakfast. So you're getting 2 mediocre benefits on trade logs. Let's rate them. Trade logs is going at the very bottom of the C tier. I had this one in the D tier for quite a while, and I decided, I think 25% trader arrive speed combined with the additional trade route slot is just enough where this is not quite D tier. I think it's okay. You probably don't want to take it though. This is not very good compared to all the other cornerstones in the tier. Most of the time you're going to pass on trade logs or just take your 10 amber. If you have bed and breakfast, you may want to take trade logs though. Trade negotiations. This one's a bit better. Trade routes are worth 1 more amber. Doesn't apply to trade routes already in progress, and it scales with the quantity of goods exported. So again, with that same example, if you have a trade route which is 1 tool and 1 provision for 3 amber, now that same trade route is going to be 4 amber, and you could sell 5 tools, 5 provisions for 20 amber. This is good. The reason this is good is because it directly impacts your quests. There's some quests that say you need to sell 5 trade routes worth 19 amber each or 17 amber each, whatever the thresholds are. And when you see those quests, this helps you. This makes it easier to reach those thresholds. And this applies to things like the Guild House, a protected trade, and Trade Hub. This makes your trade routes that much more potent. Compared to something like Deep Pockets, which is just giving you amber for trade routes, this is much better. This like actually has synergy with a lot of things. Trade Negotiations is pretty good. Let's rate it. Trade Negotiations is going in the A tier. That'll round out our A tier. I put this one slightly below the delivery lines, which I think are rather solid. Trade Negotiations, there's nothing wrong with this though. You'll probably want to give it a strong consideration. When you see it, there's a good chance this is the right pick. And that'll round out the A tier. Bed and breakfast, generous gifts, reinforced axes, steel pickaxes, root, grain, and clay delivery lines, trade negotiations, exploration contract, leather gloves, giant vegetables, and cannibalism sneaking its way into the bottom of the A tier. What the A tier means is these are really, they really stand out. These are, compared to a lot of the chaff that's going on in the B tier, these ones are rather solid. They're good at many points in the game. They're going to provide you the most value. They're not as powerful. They don't pack quite as much of a punch as the S tier cornerstones, but compared to a lot of the other epic cornerstones, these ones are good. And we're getting near the end. Training grounds. Gain +1 to lizard resolve for every 70 training gear produced. I've had a couple games where training grounds was all right. I've gotten 5 or 6 stacks out of this on some games. You're likely not going to get too much out of training grounds, and 5 or 6 stacks, if you think of that for lizards, that's like maybe like 2 global resolve stacks averaged out, because this only affects lizards, which is all right, and I think that's quite a bit. You're not likely to get up to 5 or 6 global resolve stacks or lizard resolve stacks on training grounds. Let's rate it with that in mind. Training grounds is going in the B tier, below leftover crops. This one is okay, since it is important to keep your lizards happy, and this does have a very high ceiling if you're producing a lot of training gear. This doesn't apply to training gear delivery line, of course. Probably you might be able to take this one. This is a bit of a gamble, but because it provides you global resolve stacks, it's okay. And some of the buildings that produce training gear are all right, like the Tinkerer is something you want to look out for. Next up, we have value-added tax. Gain 2 amber for every 6 pack of trade goods produced. One interesting thing to note here is if you get export specialization, this is then every 2 times you complete the pack of trade good recipe. Pack of trade goods are something that's very worth doing. They are quite valuable after the latest patch. They show up on trade routes for quite a lot of value. The queen wants them. You can get a bit of amber out of this. If you compare this to just taking 10 amber, that's 30 pack of trade goods. If you're going to produce 30 pack of trade goods, this is the same thing as declining value added tax. This does play well with export specialization and the smithy, which are all nice things to have. Value added tax, this is kind of a bloat cornerstone. I think it's okay. Let's rate it. Value added tax is going to round out our B tier. I think this is, and I do rate it slightly better than Golden Marrow because maybe you're more likely to have pack of trade good production than you are to have big stacks of sea marrow. And our B tier, quick recap, we have Sahildas Secret Cookbook, Sharp Sickles, Meat Specialization, Fungal Guide, Hidden Reward, Moldy Grain Seeds, Fiber Delivery Line, Small Press, Leftover Crops, Training Grounds, Frequent Patrols, Tanning Racks, Value Added Tax, Golden Marrow, Blood Price Contract, Deep Pockets, Grain Bags, and Firekeeper Armor. The B tier, these are really your bread and butter cornerstones. These are kind of situational, or they provide a very limited benefit overall. You don't want to be afraid to take some of these. You really want to make some assessments on the B tier and think about your current situation and does this cornerstone apply there, because that is going to be a big determination when you're thinking, do I want to take something from the B tier or not? And frequently you will want to re-roll these anyways to go fishing for something in the A tier or S tier, which is a lot better. Alright, Vineyard Town. The settlement specializes in wine production, gain +1 to beaver resolve for every 70 wine produced. Of course, this is very similar to Training Ground, but for beavers instead of lizards. And this will only be offered to you if you have beavers, same with Training Ground and lizards. This is, I think, not as good as Training Ground, because lizards are usually more important to keep happy than beavers. And I think training gear is perhaps easier to make than wine. I think things like the Tinkerer are good buildings. There's not so many good wine producing buildings. I'm not a big fan of the cellar. I've picked Vineyard Town a few times and I've never gotten a very impressive benefit out of it. There's like one game where I had a bit of stacks on Vineyard Town, but this is kind of coming out of left field, if you know what I'm saying. Let's rate it. Vineyard Town is going in the C tier. This is definitely a C+ cornerstone because I like the nearly limitless potential to make your beavers happy. And it is worth noting that beaver threshold goes up only 2 every time they gain a reputation point. So beavers do have potential to gain reputation. If you're producing a lot of wine, Vineyard Town may help you, but be very careful with this. You're probably not going to produce that much wine, so draft Vineyard Town with caution. And with that, we only have 2 cornerstones left. Let's take a peek at them. And this is your last chance to figure out where they belong. First up, we have well-rested workers, just the right amount. Villagers with the leisure need fulfilled have a plus 20% chance of doubling their yields. Okay, so how do we rate this? Is this S tier or is this C tier? You're probably not going to produce ale early on in the game. This is more of a late game cornerstone, and you need to be producing ale and consuming it to get the benefit from this. This only works with beavers and humans, so potentially, likely, you will only have beavers or humans, and this is giving you not the biggest benefit. Like, only some of your workers are going to benefit from the plus 20% chance of doubling, and you have to have ale active the whole time you're doing that. I don't care for this. I think you can pass this up the majority of the time. That said, there's no surprise as to which slot it's going to occupy on the tier list. Well-rested workers is going in the C tier. This is probably cut off from being a C plus cornerstone. I think there is, or it's on the cusp, there is some value here if you have the ale production, but you're probably not going to be using it very well. And there's only one cornerstone left in the game, and that is Zhorgs Secret Ingredient. So when I mentioned that tabloid article that said Sahildas Secret Cookbook and Zhorgs Secret Ingredient were the 2 best cornerstones to look out for in the game, well, I think they were onto something. Zhorgs Secret Ingredient is a powerhouse. Let's take a peek at it. Zhorgs Secret Ingredient, a mysterious ingredient discovered by the famous chef and businessman Zhorg. And for some reason, I always think of this guy as Elzar from Futurama, if you've ever seen the show. Like, I just imagine that's his personality. And he's like, we're going to crank it up a notch. And then he, like, yeah, pours the secret ingredient in. Gain 10 skewers for every 10 pickled goods produced. This is really good. Like, obviously, I rate this as the best epic cornerstone in the game. And why is this better than Sahildas? This is better because you can make pickled goods at the field kitchen. You don't need a special recipe, or 2 in the case of Sahildas, to start making pie. You can just plop down that field kitchen and start cranking out pickled goods. And you're going to get skewers, which is a recipe, one of the 2 recipes in the game, the other one being pie, that you can't make at the field kitchen. So if you wanted a skewer recipe before, you don't really need one anymore, because you're going to get plenty of skewers just by making pickled goods. This thing, not only does it solve a problem where you want the skewer recipe, it's doubling your food production. You can do this always at the field kitchen. This is nuts. This is the nuts. This is the best epic cornerstone in the game. This is something you want to take the vast majority of the time, and I think everyone's on board with this one. I see everyone pick this all the time, and universally people seem to consider this to be very strong. And if you're picking Zhorgs Secret Ingredient, yes, you're doing the right thing. You're doing a very right thing. That is it. That is the entire epic cornerstone tier list. If you've stuck with me so far, I really appreciate it. I do spend a fair amount of time making these videos, so if you enjoy it, that means a huge amount to me. It really does. Find me on Twitch, I'm AngryPidgeon there, and for my next series of videos, I suppose I'm taking suggestions. If not, I might do a series on how to play each biome, or possibly each modifier that you can go into a map with. Thank you for sticking around, Viceroys, and I'll see you in the Citadel, I guess, while we're on break.